Researching a soldier of the Great War can be a very rewarding experience, and many people are doing it those days because we're into the anniversaries of the war. The 100th anniversary was just last year of the start of the war. The 100th anniversary of the end of the war is in 2018. Um, Many people may think it's a daunting task, but it isn't really, because there is a lot of information in houses that can be of help to you. If there's old medals lying around in houses, there's a huge amount of information on those medals, also on documents and also old photographs. The amount of information on those can be extraordinary. Any soldier that fought in the Great War and entered the war between August 1914 and December 1915 is entitled to 3 medals. Those 3 medals are the 1914-15 Star, the Great War Medal and the Victory Medal. The amount of information on those is great. The 1914 medal was issued twice. The first people to get the 1914 medal were the British Expeditionary Force. Those were the people that were already in the army when the war started. So they were the first into the breach, as the saying goes. The 1914 Star was only issued to 340,000 men, so it is a lot rarer than the rest of them. The 1915 Star was issued later, and it was issued after November 1914 up to December 1915. And 2.25 million of those were issued. A lot more men were entered in the war at this stage. There was conscripts from Canada, all over the Commonwealth. So the army was getting a lot bigger. The other 2 medals that were issued were the Great War Medal and the Victory Medal. Each of those medals were issued to over 5 million men, because by the end of the war, that was the amount of people that had been involved in it. The information for those medals, on the Star you'll find the information on the back with number, rank and name, regiment of the man. On the British War Medal and Victory Medal, it's on the rim of the medal. So that is a lot of information. Once you're armed with that information, you will have no problem finding the medal index cards of those men. And the medal index cards gives the information when the man joined and when he left the war. Sometimes when he was wounded, if he was killed. All this information is contained on the medal index cards. The first medal index cards we're having a look at is Thomas Farrell. And as you can see from Thomas Farrell's medal, he was in the Leinster Regiment. He was a private. His number was 3131. He entered the war in September 1915, and he was transferred to Class Z, which meant that he was held after the war for a certain length of time in case the Germans went back of their word and broke the treaty. The second one we're looking at is a very interesting man, Thomas Devine. Now, Thomas Devine was in the Connacht Rangers. He was wounded early in the war. You'll see from his medal index card, he was entitled to the 14 Star British War Medal, Victory Medal. He has 3 numbers. If you look closely at his medal, you'll see he has 3 numbers. This is not unusual. If you move from one regiment to another, your number changed. Unlike the Irish Army, where you keep the same number all the time, the British Army changes as you move from one regiment to the other. Thomas Devine was a very unusual character. We'll talk about him at a later date. He was involved in the Indian Mutiny, and he was also in the Spanish Civil War. So he was one of those people that followed wars around, or wars followed him. The third one we're looking at is Francis William Howden. As you can see, there's more information on this card. His address, his father's address is on it, Carriglass, County Longford. You will see by the medal card that Francis was killed in the war. He was a very young man, he was only 19. You may be lucky that your family, your ancestors attestation papers and that have survived. A lot of them have survived indeed, and those give a lot of information then. But the basic thing is, if you have the man's number, you will find a lot of information. The next item we're looking at is the Silver War Badge. Now, the Silver War Badge was brought out in 1916, so it was the earliest medal that was brought out. And the reason it was brought out was a lot of young soldiers that were injured at the front, but it didn't appear that they were injured, were getting a lot of stick from the ladies in England. And a lot of young men committed suicide over being called a coward and that. So the Silver War Badge was to wear on your civilian attire, on your right lapel, to show that you were in the war, that you were wounded, and that you had been discharged from the army. Now, old photographs are another great way of researching a soldier. The first photograph we're looking at is Thomas Farrell, and if you look at Thomas Farrell's cap badge, you will see an unusual badge. It's the Leinster Regiment badge, so that tells you what regiment he was in. Also on his sleeve, you can see two little lines on his sleeve. They are wound marks. This man was wounded twice, so a photograph can give you a huge amount of information. The second one we're looking at is Thomas Levy. Thomas was killed in the war, but Thomas was also with the Leinster Regiment. His cap badge is a bit faded, but Thomas is also wearing a croix de guerre. He was one of the first foreigners ever to be awarded this French medal. Thomas was killed about 2 months after this photograph was taken. If your relative died in the war, there's plenty of information on him, because the Commonwealth graves have recorded every man that was killed in the war, and they nearly have photographs of the graves and where they are, what cemeteries they're in. Basically, what you need from the start is as much information as you can gather. But that doesn't say that if you haven't got the information that you will be out of luck. All you'll need is, if you have the name of the man, you can start from there, but you will need a lot of luck and a lot of patience to find the man you're looking for. But it is not impossible. In a few moments now, I'll be talking to an expert who is going to tell us the extraordinary stories of two men that fought in the war. Father Tom Maury will be here in the studio, and he will give us a rundown on Joseph Stringer Gillard and Michael Riley. Thank you. Further to our research on the medals and the medal index cards, we now have an expert in the studio with us to tell us a little more. Father Tom Maury is a member of Longford Historical Society for a number of years. He was a big contributor to our Longford at War website and takes a great interest, especially in the local aspect of the Great War. He has been to Europe, to almost every war cemetery, to photograph the graves of Longford men that have fallen. You're very welcome here this evening, Father Maury. You're going to tell us about a couple of soldiers you have researched. Is that right?
That's right, thank you, Hugh. A pleasure to be here. Of course, many Longford soldiers fought. You're talking a few thousand, perhaps maybe 3,000, and over 300 of them died. But today we're focusing on two who came back, who survived the war. One man was from Ballinallee, Joseph Stringer Gilliard, and the other man was Michael Riley from Longford Town. So looking, I suppose, at Joseph, first of all, he was born in 1891 in Ballinallee, the son of Henry and Maria Gilliard in a place called Ballyrehan, Ballinallee. He was a Church of Ireland, born Church of Ireland, one of 6 children, would have gone to the local school, local church. They were of a farming background, so he would have been involved in the normal farming jobs and tasks and so on.
In 1914 then, Joseph made a life-changing decision. Would that be right?
Fair to say. Like many young men from Longford at the time, he enlisted in a regiment, in his case the Irish Guards. The war was declared around August, September 1914. So he enlisted at that time, and after some brief training, he found himself, he was posted to the front in March 1915. And he fought there he was involved in a number of engagements on the front.
Probably all the major battles that were going on at the time.
At the time, yeah. He was involved in the Second Battle of Ypres. He was involved in another one called the Battle of Hill 60. And another battle, of course, called Neuve-Chapelle. So he was involved in those three battles. And in July 26th, I think it was, in 1915, he was discharged from the army. Now, looking at his medal card, we're not fully sure why he was discharged. It wasn't because of age, it wasn't for any disciplinary issue, because he had a very good record, but it was because of some ailment or illness, and perhaps smoke or gas inhalation, possibly.
Which would have been a big problem at the time.
Huge
so
problem.
basically that would have put an end to Joseph's military aspirations.
Well, in his case, temporarily. You'd imagine it would have. It was temporary, in fact. He came home, back to Ballyrehan to his family, and then he headed off to Canada with three of his brothers, in fact. So four of them headed off to Canada, and he went to Toronto. Now, a lot of Longford people actually were in Canada at the time. A lot of young men, in fact, enlisted from Canada. Longford men living in Canada enlisted as well. So he got employment there in Toronto, believe it or not, in a munitions factory. So
he must have been fond of the soldier, and so.
Well, he was extremely fond of the soldier, Hugh, because believe it or not, he actually enlisted again. So having been in the first time, of course, he was with the Irish Guards, and he was entitled then to 3 medals as a result of that, to the 1915 Star, and to the British War Medal and the Victory Medal, which he would have got eventually. But here he is joining up a 2nd regiment, which is unusual.
And did he see action again?
He did. This was the Canadian Irish Regiment, the 208th Canadian Irish Battalion. So again, he's posted back to the front, and he fights in the Battle of the Somme, in fact. This is now 1916. He's back. So again, as a result of that, he fought in the war, and he would have received another set of medals, a 2nd set of medals.
So he had a double issue of medals.
A double issue of medals, which is again is highly unusual. This is the first case. Now, we've studied, all of us involved in our research in Longford soldiers, all of the ones we've studied, we've never met this with a Longford soldier before. So it says something about the extraordinary spirit, indomitable fighting spirit that he goes back to the war and wins a 2nd set of medals.
It does indeed, and it's highly unusual. I don't think I've come across it in any research that I've done on the war.
I would think it very unusual, yeah. It's interesting with the medals. You'd imagine the medals of such a brave man would have been very highly sought after. They were actually sold about 3 years ago for imagine only £190 they fetched. They were put up for sale.
Yes, and you would expect them to be a highly prized collectible piece, wouldn't you?
Yeah, they were sold.
Definitely a very brave man. And the second man you're going to tell us about is a man by the name of Michael Riley.
Michael
is that
Riley.
Correct?
This is a fascinating story. I mean, Joseph's was certainly fascinating, but his is. Michael was born in Longford. And he was
probably a member of one of the Riley families here that were fairly prominent.
Prominent in the military life. Of course, being a garrison town, not unusual for young men to join up the forces. So he had a brother in the Leinster Regiment, and he had a number of cousins also who were soldiers. So he actually enlisted in 1911. So we're talking about somebody who was making the army as a career, unlike the previous man who would have just been enlisted for the war. So 1911 he joins up, he enlists in the Connacht Rangers.
Connacht Rangers, would have been a popular regiment for this area.
Very popular
with
for
the
this
Lancers,
area,
I suppose.
And he joined up in Boyle. He enlisted in Boyle,
yeah.
which was the headquarters at that time of the Connacht Rangers. So he's posted to England. After training, he's posted to England. This is 1911, 1912. And so he's posted in the reserve because, of course, it's peaceful at the time, and although I suppose the war clouds are beginning to gather in Europe, and so it wouldn't have been probably come as such a surprise in 1914 then, when they were called up for action.
And would Michael have been called up at that stage?
Called up for, yeah, with the Connacht Rangers. So he goes to the front in January 1915, just 100 years ago, and he fought in with the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, in the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, and he was actually wounded there in the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle. He received a bullet in the heart.
A bullet in the heart.
Yeah, which is quite. Now you'd imagine
And
that would have killed him, but
Exactly,
he's from
yeah.
Longford. He's
Right.
that tough Longford soldier, you know. So the bullet. So he had, of course, he's brought to hospital and so on, and they X-ray him, but they don't find any bullet. Yeah, well, the Longford men were tough, Hugh, and in his case, Michael's case, he was unconscious for a week after that. X-rays didn't show up any bullet in the heart, or didn't show up any bullet at all. They assumed the bullet had exited the body, and after a short time, he's back on the front again, involved in the war, and receives another injury. This time it's a shrapnel injury to the leg, which necessitates further surgery, further X-rays, and again it doesn't show the bullet in the heart. So at that stage, he leaves sort of in, if you like, active service and goes to the Labour Corps.
Yeah, the Labour Corps would have been a kind of a backup battalion for anyone that was lightly injured, probably with a slight wound or that, but
Yeah, so
a man with a bullet in his heart, you couldn't put down as a slight wound.
a
but
slight wound. I mean,
that's-
here he is, you know, certainly the walking wounded. And so the war finishes, and the armistice in 1918, and he's discharged at that stage from the army. He comes back to Longford to live with his wife and family, still with the bullet in the heart. Now, 10 years later, he suffers from ill health. So 10 years later, in 1915, he goes to his local doctor, Dr. Maury Farrell, and she sends him off to Dublin, to the Richmond Hospital in Dublin, and there finally, with new X-rays, probably more improved X-ray techniques, they actually discovered the bullet in the heart.
It's incredible that the man survived 10 years with the bullet in his heart from 1915
Can
to
just
1925.
imagine, yeah. Having gone through all of that, like even today, you can imagine how unusual that would be.
So he must have been a bit of a celebrity.
Yeah, well, what happened then, he goes to, the Richmond Hospital recommends him to go to London, or to England, where in Roehampton Hospital in England, a Major Roberts, Surgeon Major Roberts, performs pioneering heart surgery there.
Imagine, yes.
And it got massive publicity right across the world, and successful operation. And a month later, he was actually invited to Buckingham Palace, to King George, where King George was hosting a garden party. So he did actually become a major celebrity, and the story was picked up all over the world. The story of Michael Riley, Longford soldier with the bullet in the heart.
And did he live to enjoy any time back in Longford?
Yes, this is 1925. He lives for another 19 years, and with his wife and family. He only died in 1944, and his family actually still have the bullet, believe it or not.
That's amazing. An amazing story.
Which is still there. So, two extraordinary men in different ways. So, that's the story of
They're
Michael
certainly
Riley.
tough men, those Longford men.
I would agree.
Thanks very much, Father Tom, for those two amazing stories on those two Longford men. For any of you that are researching your ancestors, I hope this programme was of help to you. The medal cards, the medal index cards. Each person tracing their ancestors probably go a different trail. But you will find plenty of information out there. And at the end of this programme, we will put up a number of websites that can be of help to you. Some of them can be purchased, and a lot of them are free, like the Commonwealth War Graves website, different ones like that. So thank you very much. Thank you, Father Tom, and good night.
I see my old comrades, how proudly they march, viewing their dreams of past glory. I see